The whispers reached Katherine Landon's ears before she even saw the gathering crowd outside the bank in Medicine Bow, Wyoming. It was the spring of 1876, and the small frontier town was abuzz with accusations that would change her life forever. Thief. The word hung in the air like gunsmoke as Katherine approached the commotion, her heart pounding against her ribs. The crowd had formed a semicircle around a tall, dust-covered cowboy whose hands were bound behind his back. Sheriff Mills stood beside him, one hand firmly gripping the man's arm, the other resting on the butt of his pistol. "I didn't steal anything," the cowboy insisted, his voice steady despite the situation. "I was making a withdrawal from my own account." Katherine pushed her way through the crowd, drawn by something in the stranger's voice, a certainty, a dignity that seemed at odds with the accusations being hurled at him. She had lived in Medicine Bow for just 6 months since arriving from Boston, but she'd learned quickly how justice sometimes worked in frontier towns, swiftly and not always fairly. The cowboy stood tall despite his restraints, his broad shoulders squared and chin held high. His dark hair curled from beneath a worn Stetson, and his eyes a piercing blue that reminded Katherine of the summer sky scanned the hostile faces surrounding him. "Blake Kincaid's been caught red-handed," announced Mayor Thornton, his round face flushed with self-importance. $1,500 missing from the bank, and this drifter just happens to be leaving town with exactly that amount. "It's my money," Blake repeated, the muscle in his jaw tightening. "I sold 50 head of cattle to the Henderson Ranch last week. Ask Henderson himself." "Henderson's 3 days' ride from here," Sheriff Mills replied. "Convenient for your story, isn't it?" Katherine didn't know what possessed her in that moment. Perhaps it was the quiet dignity in the cowboy's stance, or the way the townspeople seemed all too eager to condemn a stranger. Or maybe it was simply that in 6 months in Medicine Bow, she'd seen enough rushed judgments to last a lifetime. "I believe you," Katherine said, stepping forward from the crowd. Her voice rang clear across the dusty street, silencing the murmurs. Every head turned toward her, the schoolteacher who had come from back east, still something of an outsider herself. Blake Kincaid's blue eyes found hers, surprise flickering across his weathered features before a flash of gratitude replaced it. "Miss Landon," Mayor Thornton sputtered, "this is hardly your concern. This man is a thief, and has there been a trial, Mayor Thornton?" Katherine asked, keeping her gaze steady despite the hammering of her heart. "Or have we abandoned the notion of innocence until proven guilty here in Medicine Bow?" Sheriff Mills narrowed his eyes. "Miss Landon, I understand your Eastern sensibilities might find our justice rough, but we have evidence. Mr. Wilson at the bank reported the money missing immediately after this man departed. And I'm telling you, it's my money," Blake insisted again, a newfound energy in his voice now that someone had spoken in his defense. "I have the bill of sale in my saddlebag." "A piece of paper anyone could have written," scoffed the mayor. Katherine moved closer to Blake, conscious of the whispers that followed her. At 26, she had come west to teach after the death of her parents left her with no family ties in Boston. She had hoped for a fresh start, not to become embroiled in controversy. Yet something about the injustice unfolding before her stirred a defiance she couldn't suppress. "Sheriff, if Mr. Kincaid has documentation, shouldn't you at least examine it before condemning him? And Mr. Wilson," she turned to the bank manager who stood nervously at the edge of the crowd, "are you absolutely certain the money is missing? Could there have been an accounting error?" Wilson adjusted his spectacles uncomfortably. "Well, that is to say, the ledger showed a discrepancy after Mr. Kincaid made his withdrawal, but you didn't actually see him take anything beyond his own funds," Katherine pressed. No, not as such, but Sheriff, please check my saddlebag, Blake interrupted. The bill of sale is there, along with a letter from Jim Henderson himself. The crowd's mood began to shift subtly. Doubt crept into expressions that moments before had been certain of guilt. Sheriff Mills hesitated, then nodded to his deputy. Check his horse, Thompson. Let's see this supposed proof. As the deputy moved to retrieve Blake's belongings, Katherine remained by the cowboy's side, aware of how her actions would be perceived. A respectable schoolteacher defending a stranger, a rugged cowboy no less, would set tongues wagging for weeks. Yet she couldn't bring herself to step away. Why? Blake murmured, just loud enough for her to hear. Why stand up for me when you don't know me from Adam? Katherine met his gaze, surprised by the intensity she found there. Because I've seen how quickly this town jumps to conclusions. And because you didn't look guilty, just angry at the injustice of it all. A hint of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. You're either very perceptive or very foolish, Miss Landon, Katherine Landon. Much obliged, Miss Landon. I won't forget this. The deputy returned moments later, a folded document and sealed envelope in his hands. Sheriff Mills examined them, his expression gradually shifting from suspicion to uncertainty. This appears legitimate, he admitted reluctantly, holding up the bill of sale. And this letter does bear Henderson's seal. Perhaps we should send a wire to confirm, Mayor Thornton suggested, unwilling to concede so easily. By all means, Blake agreed. But in the meantime, I believe these bindings are unnecessary, Sheriff. After a moment's hesitation, Mills nodded and untied Blake's hands. You'll stay in town until we confirm your story, Kincaid. Wouldn't have it any other way, Blake replied, rubbing his wrists. I intend to get to the bottom of this missing money business myself. Someone's trying to frame me, and I aim to find out who. The crowd began to disperse, some looking disappointed that the excitement had fizzled, others embarrassed at their quick judgment. Katherine found herself still standing beside Blake, suddenly aware of how tall he was up close, at least a foot taller than her 5 feet and 4 inches. Thank you, Blake said, his voice low and sincere. Not many would risk their reputation for a stranger. Katherine felt a flush rise to her cheeks. I should be getting back to the schoolhouse. The children will be returning from lunch soon. You're the school teacher. There was surprise in his voice and something else, a note of admiration, perhaps. Yes, since last fall. I came from Boston. A long way from home, Katherine smiled slightly. Medicine Bow is my home now. Blake studied her face for a moment as if committing it to memory. Well, Miss Katherine Landon of Medicine Bow, it seems I'm in your debt, and a Kincaid always repays his debts. Katherine wasn't sure how to respond to the intensity in his gaze. No debt necessary, Mr. Kincaid. I simply spoke up for what seemed right. Blake. My name's Blake. He tipped his hat slightly. And doing what's right when everyone else is doing wrong, that's rare enough to warrant gratitude. With a final nod, Katherine turned and walked briskly toward the schoolhouse, acutely aware of the eyes following her progress down the street. She could already imagine the gossip. The proper Boston schoolteacher defending a rough-and-tumble cowboy against the town's leading citizens. Her reputation might never recover, and yet she couldn't bring herself to regret her actions. There had been something in Blake Kincaid's eyes, a steadfastness, an honor that had compelled her to speak. Whether that instinct proved wise or foolish remained to be seen. By the time school dismissed that afternoon, word had spread throughout Medicine Bow. Katherine felt the stares and whispers as she walked from the schoolhouse to her small home near the edge of town. Mrs. Gardner, who ran the general store, barely met her eyes when she stopped in for supplies. Mr. Peterson, the blacksmith, tipped his hat, but with noticeably less warmth than usual. "You've caused quite a stir, Miss Landon," a voice said as she exited the store. Katherine turned to find Margaret Winters, the widow who served on the town council and had been one of the few to welcome Katherine warmly when she arrived. "Mrs. Winters," Katherine acknowledged with a slight nod. "I suppose I have." The older woman fell into step beside her. "Standing up for that cowboy in front of half the town, it was bold, I'll give you that, but perhaps not wise." "You think he's guilty?" Katherine asked. Mrs. Winters shrugged her thin shoulders. "I think it doesn't matter what I believe. This town has certain expectations of its schoolteacher, particularly a young, unmarried one. That I should stand by while an innocent man is condemned. That you should be circumspect, cautious." Mrs. Winters lowered her voice. "The school board takes a keen interest in the moral character of its teachers." The warning was clear, and Katherine felt a flutter of anxiety. The teaching position was her livelihood, her independence, yet she lifted her chin slightly. "I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Winters, truly, but I couldn't have acted differently." The older woman studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "You're stubborn, just like my Sarah was. Heaven rest her." She patted Katherine's arm. "Well, if you're determined to befriend this cowboy, at least be careful. Not everyone in Medicine Bow is as they appear." With that cryptic warning, Mrs. Winters departed, leaving Katherine wondering precisely what she meant and whom. Later that evening, as Katherine sat on her small porch with a cup of tea, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple, she heard footsteps approaching. Looking up, she was surprised to see Blake Kincaid walking toward her modest home, his hat in his hands. Katherine set her teacup down, suddenly conscious of her simple calico dress and hair loosened from its usual pins after a long day of teaching. "Mr. Kincaid," she said, rising from her chair, "Miss Landon." He stopped at the bottom of the 3 steps that led to her porch. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," she replied, though propriety suggested that a single woman receiving a male visitor at dusk was indeed an intrusion of sorts. "How may I help you?" Blake shifted his weight, and Katherine was struck by the notion that this man who had faced down an angry mob with unwavering composure seemed almost nervous. "I wanted to thank you properly for what you did today," he said, "and to apologize." Katherine tilted her head. "Apologize? For what?" "For the difficulty I've caused you. Word travels fast in small towns. I've heard the whispers already about the schoolteacher who defended the accused thief." "You've heard correctly, but you needn't apologize. It was my choice to speak up." Blake nodded, a strand of dark hair falling across his forehead. "All the same, I'm sorry for any trouble it's brought you, and I wanted you to know the sheriff received confirmation from Henderson's ranch. The sale was legitimate, so you've been exonerated. Of the theft charge, yes. But the money's still missing from the bank, and some folks think that's too convenient a coincidence." He looked up at her, his expression grave. "I'm staying to clear my name completely. Someone set me up, and I aim to find out who and why." Katherine's curiosity piqued. "You believe it was deliberate, not just a banking error?" "The timing's too perfect. I rode into town yesterday, made my withdrawal this morning, and suddenly there's money missing exactly the amount I legally withdrew." He shook his head. "No, somebody wanted me blamed for this." "But who would want to frame a stranger?" Katherine asked, forgetting propriety enough to descend the steps until she stood just a few feet from him. "And why? That's what I intend to find out." Blake's blue eyes held hers. "But I didn't come to burden you with my troubles. I came to say thank you and to warn you that you might want to distance yourself from me until this is resolved." "Your reputation—" "My reputation is my own concern, Mr. Kincaid," Katherine interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. And I'm not in the habit of abandoning what I believe to be right simply because it's inconvenient. A slow smile spread across Blake's face, transforming his features from merely handsome to something that made Catherine's heart beat a little faster. I'm beginning to understand why the children of Medicine Bow speak so highly of their teacher. I met a few of them at the hotel where I'm staying. They said you're strict but fair, and that you tell the best stories they've ever heard. Catherine felt a blush rise to her cheeks. They're good children, eager to learn. They're fortunate to have a teacher with courage as well as knowledge. Blake replaced his hat, tipping it slightly. I won't keep you any longer, Miss Landon. I just wanted to express my gratitude and to say that if you ever need anything while I'm in town, you need only ask. Thank you, Mr. Kincaid. Blake, he corrected gently. After what you did today, I think we're beyond formalities. Catherine hesitated, then nodded. Blake, then. And I'm Catherine, he repeated as if testing the sound of it. It suits you, strong but with a certain grace to it. Before she could formulate a response to the unexpected compliment, he tipped his hat again and turned to go. Good evening, Catherine. I hope we'll meet again soon. As she watched him walk away, his tall figure outlined against the darkening sky, Catherine had the distinct feeling that they would indeed meet again, and that when they did, her life in Medicine Bow would never be the same. The following morning, Catherine arrived at the schoolhouse earlier than usual, hoping to avoid the stares and whispers that had followed her the previous afternoon. The small building, with its weathered clapboard siding and single bell tower, had become her sanctuary in the months since she'd arrived in Medicine Bow. Inside, she busied herself arranging books and writing arithmetic problems on the blackboard, trying to focus on the day's lessons rather than the memory of Blake Kincaid standing in the twilight outside her home. She was so absorbed in her preparations that she didn't hear the door open until a throat cleared behind her. Catherine turned to find Harold Jenkins, president of the school board and owner of the town's largest cattle ranch, standing just inside the entrance. Mr. Jenkins, she said, setting down her chalk. This is a surprise. Jenkins was a portly man in his 50s with mutton-chop sideburns and small, assessing eyes that never seemed to miss a detail. He'd been polite but distant since hiring Catherine, making no secret of the fact that he'd preferred a male teacher but had been outvoted by the other board members. Miss Landon, he said with a curt nod. I thought it prudent to have a word before the children arrive. Catherine's stomach tightened. Of course. What can I do for you? You can explain your behavior yesterday, Jenkins said without preamble. Publicly defending a stranger accused of theft, contradicting the sheriff and mayor in front of half the town. It's most irregular behavior for a schoolteacher. Catherine straightened her spine. I spoke up because I believed an injustice was occurring, and it seems I was correct. Mr. Kincaid has been cleared of wrongdoing. Cleared of stealing, perhaps, but the money's still missing. And that's beside the point. Jenkins fixed her with a stern look. The point, Miss Landon, is that teachers in this community are held to the highest moral standards. They must be above reproach, especially unmarried female teachers. I fail to see how defending an innocent man falls below moral standards, Catherine replied, trying to keep her voice even. It's not what you did, it's how you did it, making a public spectacle, contradicting the town's leadership. Jenkins shook his head. Several parents have expressed concern about your judgment. Have any withdrawn their children from my class? Catherine challenged. Jenkins hesitated. No, not yet. But then perhaps their concern isn't as great as you suggest. Catherine met his gaze squarely. Mr. Jenkins, I was hired to teach the children of Medicine Bow reading, writing, arithmetic, and moral character. What example would I set if I stood silently by while an innocent man was wrongly accused? For a moment, Jenkins seemed taken aback by her directness. Then his expression hardened. You are not hired to insert yourself into town affairs or to question the judgment of its officials. The school board will be watching your conduct closely, Miss Landon. Very closely. Without waiting for her response, he turned and left, the door closing with a bang that echoed in the empty schoolroom. Katherine exhaled shakily, her hands gripping the edge of her desk. The threat was clear. Her position, her livelihood, was in jeopardy. Yet she couldn't bring herself to regret standing up for Blake. By the time her students began arriving, Katherine had composed herself outwardly, greeting each child with a warm smile. But inwardly, her thoughts churned. She'd come to Medicine Bow seeking independence and a fresh start after years of feeling stifled in Boston. Now, she faced the possibility of losing everything because she'd spoken her conscience. The school day passed in a blur of lessons, her mind only half present as she guided her students through their studies. When the final bell rang, Katherine found herself oddly reluctant to leave the schoolhouse for the scrutiny that awaited her in town. She was still gathering her things when there was another knock at the door. Expecting perhaps a student who had forgotten a book, she called, "Come in," without looking up. "I hope I'm not interrupting," came a familiar deep voice. Katherine's head jerked up to find Blake Kincaid standing in the doorway, hat in hand once again. Today he wore a clean shirt and vest, his dark hair damp as if recently washed. "Blake," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "What brings you to the schoolhouse?" He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, an action that would have raised eyebrows had anyone witnessed it. "I had a couple of visitors this morning who mentioned you might be having some trouble because of me." Katherine frowned. "Visitors?" "Tommy and Sarah Miller. Bright kids. They said their pa was talking about pulling them from school because the teacher was associating with questionable characters." Blake's mouth twisted in a wry smile. "I gather I'm the questionable character in question." Katherine sighed, setting down the stack of primers she'd been organizing. "The school board president paid me a visit this morning. He made similar intimations." "I'm sorry, Katherine. That's exactly what I was afraid of." Blake took a few steps closer, his expression earnest. "Look, I appreciate what you did yesterday more than I can say. But I don't want you risking your position here. These children need you." The concern in his eyes touched her. "And what about you? Don't you deserve someone standing beside you while you clear your name?" "I've weathered worse storms alone," he replied, but something in his voice suggested that the solitude hadn't been by choice. Katherine studied him for a moment. There was a story there. She sensed one that went beyond a case of mistaken theft. "Why is clearing your name so important?" "Most men in your position would have moved on once the immediate accusation was disproved." Blake hesitated, then moved to one of the student desks, looking almost comically large as he leaned against it. "I've spent the last 5 years rebuilding my reputation after losing everything. My father's ranch, my family name, my place in society such as it was." "What happened?" Katherine asked softly, drawn to the undercurrent of pain in his voice. "A woman happened." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "I was young and foolish, the son of a successful rancher in Colorado. She was beautiful and cunning, the daughter of my father's rival. I thought it was love. She saw an opportunity." Katherine waited, sensing there was more to the story. "She convinced me my father was cheating her father in a land deal. I confronted him, publicly, viciously. Took her side against my own blood." Blake's jaw tightened at the memory. "Turned out she and her father had engineered the whole thing. By the time I learned the truth, my father had disowned me. The ranch was lost in a leveraged deal, and she was engaged to the banker who'd facilitated it all. "I'm so sorry," Katherine said, genuinely moved by the pain evident in his face. Blake shrugged, a gesture that failed to convey the nonchalance he clearly intended. It was a hard lesson in trust. Since then, I've been working my way back, building a herd of my own, trying to restore the Kincaid name. That sale to Henderson was my first real success, enough money to put a down payment on a small spread of my own. His blue eyes locked with hers. "So you see, Katherine, I can't just ride away with people whispering thief behind my back. Not again. Not when I've worked so hard." Katherine's heart ached for him. She understood all too well the struggle to build something meaningful after loss. Hadn't she done the same in coming west after her parents' deaths? "Then don't face it alone," she said impulsively. "Two heads are better than one for solving mysteries. And I know this town and its people better than you do." Blake straightened, shaking his head. "I can't ask that of you. Your position here, you didn't ask. I offered." Katherine squared her shoulders. "Besides, if I'm going to be gossiped about anyway, I might as well deserve it." A smile slowly spread across Blake's face, that same transformative smile that had caught her breath the night before. "You're not what I expected to find in Medicine Bow, Katherine Landon. No. And what did you expect? Certainly not a Boston schoolteacher with the courage of a gunslinger and the determination of a bulldog." Katherine laughed despite herself. "I'm not certain that's entirely flattering." "It wasn't meant to be flattering," Blake replied, his eyes twinkling. "It was meant to be true." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, a current of understanding passing between them that went beyond their brief acquaintance. Then Blake cleared his throat. "If you're serious about helping, I could use your insights. Someone in this town wanted me blamed for that missing money. Someone who knew I'd be making a large withdrawal. The question is who and why." Katherine considered this. "How many people knew about your business with Henderson?" "That's just it, I'm not sure. I didn't announce it, but I wasn't secretive either. I stayed at the hotel, had meals at the diner, visited the saloon a couple of times. Could have mentioned it to a dozen people." "And the amount? Did you specify the sum to anyone?" Blake frowned in concentration. "Not deliberately, but—" "Yes, I did discuss figures with Wilson at the bank the day before. I wanted to be sure they could handle a withdrawal that size." "So Wilson knew," Katherine mused. "The bank manager himself. Interesting. You suspect him?" Blake asked. "I don't suspect anyone yet. But if we're to solve this, we need to start somewhere." Katherine began gathering her things with renewed purpose. "Let's start with what we know. The timing, the exact amount missing, and who had access to that information." As they left the schoolhouse together, Katherine was acutely aware of the stares that followed them down the street. Mrs. Peterson hurried her young daughter to the other side of the road. Old Mr. Flanagan, whittling on the bench outside the barber shop, paused to watch them pass with narrowed eyes. "Your reputation is suffering by the minute," Blake murmured. "Let it," Katherine replied, though a part of her cringed at the judgment in those stares. "What matters now is finding the truth." They agreed to meet the following day after school to begin their investigation in earnest. As Katherine watched Blake walk toward the hotel, his tall figure cutting a distinctive silhouette against the afternoon sun, she wondered if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life, or if, somehow, defending this man would prove to be a turning point she could never have anticipated. Either way, she realized with a start, Medicine Bow suddenly felt a lot less like the quiet, predictable town she'd come to know. That night, Katherine couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, her mind racing with thoughts of missing money, school board threats, and a pair of intense blue eyes that seemed to see right through her carefully constructed composure. When she finally did drift off near dawn, Her dreams were a jumbled mess of accusations and defenses, with Blake standing alone against a hostile crowd while she tried to reach him through an invisible barrier. She woke feeling as tired as when she'd gone to bed, but with a renewed determination. Whatever the consequences, she would help Blake clear his name. Not just because it was the right thing to do, but because in the short time she'd known him, she'd recognized something in him that resonated with her own experience: the struggle to build a life on your own terms, to overcome past mistakes and others' expectations. The school day dragged interminably. Katherine noticed several parents watching her with suspicious eyes when they dropped off their children, and even some of her students seemed subdued, as if they'd overheard worrying discussions at home. Only little Emma Thompson, the blacksmith's daughter, seemed unchanged, bringing Katherine a slightly wilted wildflower and announcing loudly, "Pa says you're a good teacher even if you do have poor judgment in men." Katherine had to stifle a laugh at the child's innocent repetition. "Thank you for the flower, Emma, and please tell your father I appreciate his qualified support." When the final bell rang, Katherine dismissed her students and quickly tidied the classroom, her heart beating a little faster at the prospect of meeting Blake. She told herself it was merely anticipation of solving the mystery, nothing more. She was just locking the schoolhouse door when a shadow fell across the steps. Looking up, she expected to see Blake, but instead found the town's young doctor, James Miller, standing there with his hat in his hands. "Dr. Miller," she greeted him with surprise. The doctor had arrived in Medicine Bow just a month before Katherine and had been unfailingly polite in their few interactions. "Miss Landon," he replied with a slight bow. "I was hoping to catch you after school." Katherine descended the steps, keys in hand. "Is something wrong? Is one of the children ill?" "No, nothing like that." Miller cleared his throat nervously. "Actually, I wanted to speak with you about your association with this Kincaid fellow." Katherine felt her shoulders tense. "I wasn't aware that my associations were a matter for medical concern, Doctor." Miller had the grace to look embarrassed. "They're not, of course. I speak as a friend, Miss Landon. The town is talking, and not kindly. I've heard whispers that your position might be in jeopardy." "And why does that concern you specifically?" Katherine asked, more curious than defensive. A flush crept up Miller's neck. "I've admired you since you arrived in Medicine Bow. Your dedication to the children, your intellect, everything about you, frankly." He took a deep breath. "I had hoped in time to court you properly, but this situation with Kincaid, it's damaging your standing in the community. I thought perhaps if you were seen with me instead, a respectable professional." Katherine stared at him, momentarily speechless. She'd had no idea the doctor harbored such feelings for her. He was handsome enough, certainly, with his neat appearance and earnest brown eyes, and his profession gave him a respected place in the community. A year ago, she might have been flattered by his interest. But now, all she felt was a surprising surge of irritation. "Let me understand this correctly," she said carefully. "You're suggesting I abandon someone I believe to be innocent of wrongdoing, someone who needs an ally, in order to preserve my reputation and coincidentally further your romantic aspirations." Miller blinked, clearly not having expected this reaction. That is, when you put it that way, it sounds rather self-serving, but I assure you, it sounds exactly what it is," Katherine interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. "And while I'm flattered by your regard, Dr. Miller, I make my own decisions about who deserves my support. Even at the cost of your position, your future here," Miller pressed. "If my future in Medicine Bow depends on abandoning my principles, then perhaps it's not the future I thought it was," Katherine replied quietly. Miller studied her for a long moment, his expression shifting from embarrassment to something like resignation. "You care for him," he said. "This Kincaid. I can see it in your face when you speak of him." Katherine opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again. Did she care for Blake? She'd known him barely 2 days. Yet there was something about him, something that had resonated with her from the moment she stepped forward in that crowd. "What I care about," she said carefully, "is justice and the truth. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an appointment to keep." As if summoned by her words, Blake appeared at the corner of the street, striding toward the schoolhouse. He slowed when he saw Miller, his expression cautious. "Dr. Miller," Katherine said with finality, "thank you for your concern. I'll give it the consideration it deserves." With that, she moved past him toward Blake, aware of Miller watching them as she greeted the cowboy with more warmth than was perhaps strictly necessary. "Everything all right?" Blake asked quietly as they walked away together. Katherine glanced back to see Miller still standing by the schoolhouse, a forlorn figure in his neat coat. "Yes," she replied, turning her attention back to Blake. "Just navigating the complexities of small-town life." Blake nodded, seeming to understand without further explanation. "I've been doing some investigating this morning," he said as they turned onto the main street. "Thought we might compare notes over coffee if you're agreeable." "Very agreeable," Katherine replied, suddenly acutely conscious of how her arm occasionally brushed against his as they walked, and of the speculative glances from townspeople they passed. "Where shall we go?" Blake hesitated, clearly also aware of the attention they were attracting. "The hotel dining room is public enough to be proper but quiet enough for private conversation." Katherine nodded her agreement, and they made their way to Medicine Bow's only hotel, a 3-story building that was the town's pride and one of the few structures built of brick rather than wood. Inside, the dining room was sparsely populated at this hour between lunch and dinner, allowing them to secure a quiet corner table. After ordering coffee from a waitress who could barely contain her curiosity, Blake leaned forward. "I spent the morning talking with some of the businesses around town. Turns out Wilson from the bank isn't as well liked as I first thought. Several shopkeepers mentioned he's been pressing them hard for loan repayments lately." "That's interesting," Katherine mused, adding a spoonful of sugar to her coffee. "The bank's been struggling, not according to what I heard. Quite the opposite. Town's growing, new deposits coming in. But Wilson's been acting peculiar, according to Mrs. Winters at the Mercantile." "Mrs. Winters noticed something amiss?" Katherine leaned forward, intrigued. The widow had always struck her as keenly observant. "Said Wilson's been visiting the telegraph office almost daily, sending messages to Denver. And he's been uncharacteristically flush with cash, bought a new suit and pocket watch last month." Katherine considered this. So Wilson might have financial dealings beyond the bank. That could be significant or entirely innocent. "True," Blake acknowledged. "But there's more. I spoke with the telegraph operator, Sam Birch. He confirmed Wilson's been sending frequent messages to a banking firm in Denver and receiving replies that seemed to upset him." "How so?" "Sam said Wilson would read the telegrams and turn white as a sheet, stuff them in his pocket, and practically run from the office." Blake took a sip of his coffee. "What did you learn today?" Katherine had spent her lunch hour making casual inquiries among her students about their parents' banking habits, a tactic that had yielded surprising results. "Several of my students mentioned their parents withdrawing savings from the bank recently," she explained. "Apparently there have been rumors that the bank isn't as solid as it appears. Nothing specific, just whispers." Blake's expression sharpened. "Whispers that could cause a run on the bank if they spread widely enough." "Exactly." Katherine lowered her voice. And if Wilson has been misusing funds or making poor investments, then $1,500 suddenly missing might be very convenient, Blake finished. A scapegoat me to explain larger discrepancies. They looked at each other, the same thought clearly occurring to both of them. We need to see the bank's ledgers, Katherine said. Blake nodded. That won't be easy. Wilson keeps them locked in his office. Not always, Katherine countered. Once a month he presents the books to the town council for review, and as luck would have it, that meeting is tomorrow evening. Blake raised an eyebrow. You seem remarkably well informed about bank procedures, schoolteacher. Katherine smiled slightly. Medicine Bow may be small, but its gossip network is comprehensive. Mrs. Winters serves on the council and mentions the meetings frequently. So we need access to those ledgers, Blake mused. I don't suppose you're friendly enough with Mrs. Winters to ask for a private viewing. Not without raising suspicions, Katherine admitted, but there might be another way. The council meets in the back room of the town hall. I sometimes use that room for school presentations. I have a key. Blake's eyes widened slightly. Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? That we examine the ledgers before the council meeting? Yes, I am. Katherine surprised herself with her boldness, but the idea had formed fully in her mind. If Wilson is hiding something, the evidence will be in those books. And if he's been falsifying entries, we need to see them before he has a chance to create a new version for the council. That's risky, Katherine, Blake said, his voice lowering further. If we're caught, then I lose my position and you're labeled a thief permanently, she acknowledged. But if we're right about Wilson, it's worth the risk. Blake studied her face for a long moment, then a slow smile spread across his features. You continue to surprise me, Katherine Landon. I never would have taken you for a woman willing to bend the rules. There's a difference between bending rules and seeking justice, she replied, though she felt a flutter of anxiety at what she was proposing. Besides, we're not stealing anything just looking at public records before they are publicly reviewed. Blake chuckled. That's quite a fine distinction, but I'll accept it. He reached across the table, briefly touching her hand before withdrawing. Thank you for believing in me. Few have these past years. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through Katherine. Perhaps they simply didn't know you well enough, she said softly. Their eyes held for a moment, something unspoken passing between them that made Katherine's heart beat faster. Then Blake cleared his throat and leaned back. So, we have a plan. Tomorrow evening before the council meeting. What time? The meeting starts at 7. The ledgers will likely arrive by 6:30, if we could get there by 6. I'll meet you at the schoolhouse at 5:45, Blake decided. We'll walk to the town hall together, less suspicious than meeting there directly. As they finalized their plans, Katherine couldn't help but reflect on the strangeness of her situation. A week ago, she had been the respectable schoolteacher, careful of her reputation, focused solely on her students. Now she was planning what amounted to breaking and entering with a man. She barely knew a man who made her pulse quicken with just a look. What would her parents have thought? Her proper Boston mother would have been scandalized. But her father, the man who had taught her that truth was worth fighting for, even at great cost perhaps he would have understood. When they parted outside the hotel, Blake took her hand briefly. Be careful until tomorrow, he said. If Wilson is behind this, he won't appreciate your involvement. I'll be fine, Katherine assured him. I'm just a school teacher, remember. No one suspects me of investigating anything more serious than spelling errors. Blake didn't look entirely convinced, but he nodded, releasing her hand reluctantly. Until tomorrow, then. As Katherine walked back to her small house, she found herself glancing over her shoulder more than once, an uneasy feeling persisting despite her brave words. If Wilson had deliberately framed Blake, what else might he be capable of? That night, as she prepared for bed, a knock at her door startled her. It was late for visitors past 9 o'clock. Cautiously, she approached the door. "Who's there?" she called. "It's Margaret Winters, dear. May I come in? It's rather urgent." Relieved to hear the older woman's voice, Katherine opened the door to find Mrs. Winters on her porch, a shawl wrapped tightly around her thin shoulders against the evening chill. "Mrs. Winters, please, come in." Katherine ushered her inside, concerned by the agitation visible on the widow's face. "Is something wrong?" "I'm afraid so, my dear." Mrs. Winters sank into a chair by the small fireplace. "I've just come from a rather disturbing conversation with Wilson from the bank. He was asking questions about you and about your association with that Kincaid fellow." Katherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "What kind of questions?" "Whether you'd been inquiring about bank matters, whether you'd shown any unusual interest in financial affairs." Mrs. Winters fixed Katherine with a penetrating look. "I told him you were a schoolteacher, not a banker, and that your interests extended to educating children, not counting money. But he seemed suspicious." "Did he say why he was asking?" "No, but his manner was most peculiar, almost nervous." The older woman leaned forward. "Katherine, I don't know what you're involved in, but Wilson is not a man to be trifled with. There have been rumors." "What rumors?" Katherine asked, sitting across from her visitor. Mrs. Winters hesitated. "Nothing specific, just whispers that the bank's finances aren't as sound as they should be, that Wilson has been making investments without the board's full knowledge." She reached out to pat Katherine's hand. "I've grown fond of you, my dear. You remind me of my daughter, smart, principled, perhaps too brave for your own good. I would hate to see you come to harm because of misplaced loyalty to a stranger." Katherine considered how much to reveal. Mrs. Winters had been kind to her since her arrival, and the older woman's position on the town council could be valuable. But could she trust her completely, Mrs. Winters? She said carefully. If someone in a position of trust were misusing that position hypothetically, wouldn't it be right to expose them, no matter the personal cost? The widow studied her for a long moment. "Hypothetically," she finally replied, "I would say that justice should always prevail over convenience, but I would also caution that justice pursued recklessly can lead to harm for the very ones seeking it." She squeezed Katherine's hand. "Be careful, my dear. Whatever you're planning, and I can see in your eyes that you're planning something, proceed with caution." "I will," Katherine promised. "And thank you for the warning about Wilson." After Mrs. Winters departed, Katherine found sleep even more elusive than the previous night. The widow's warning had confirmed her suspicions about Wilson, but added a new layer of concern. If the banker was already suspicious of her inquiries, their plan for tomorrow might be even riskier than she'd thought. Yet she couldn't bring herself to abandon it. Not when Blake's future and possibly her own hung in the balance. The following day crawled by with excruciating slowness. Katherine found it difficult to concentrate on her lessons, her mind repeatedly wandering to the evening's planned activities. The children seemed to sense her distraction, becoming unusually restless and talkative. "Miss Landon, are you feeling poorly?" asked 10-year-old Jimmy Carter when she had to ask him to repeat a question for the third time. "Just a slight headache, Jimmy," she replied with a forced smile. "Nothing to worry about." When the school day finally ended, Katherine hurried home to change from her teaching dress to something less conspicuous, a simple dark blue skirt and jacket that wouldn't stand out in the evening shadows. As the appointed time approached, she found herself pacing nervously in her small parlor, second-guessing their plan. What if they were caught? What if Wilson had already altered the ledgers? What if there was nothing suspicious to find, and Blake really had been the victim of a simple banking error? A soft knock at precisely 5:45 interrupted her anxious thoughts. Blake stood on her porch, similarly dressed in dark clothing, his usual Stetson replaced by a less distinctive cap. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Katherine nodded, too nervous for small talk. They walked toward the town hall in silence, taking a circuitous route that avoided the main street and its curious eyes. The evening was settling in, long shadows stretching across the dirt roads, a few early stars appearing in the deep blue sky. The town hall, a modest two-story building that served multiple purposes in Medicine Bow, was dark and quiet when they approached from the rear. Katherine's hands trembled slightly as she unlocked the back door with her key, the click of the lock seeming unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Anyone likely to be inside at this hour?" Blake whispered as they slipped through the door. Katherine shook her head. "The caretaker only comes in mornings, and the council members won't arrive for at least another half hour." They made their way through the darkened building to the council chamber, a large room with a long table surrounded by chairs. At one end, a smaller table held a stack of ledgers already delivered for the evening's meeting. "There they are," Katherine whispered, moving quickly toward the books. Blake lit a small lamp they'd brought, adjusting the wick to provide just enough light to read by without being visible from outside. Together, they began examining the most recent ledger, heads bent close together over the columns of figures. "Look here," Blake said after several minutes, his finger tracing a series of entries. "These withdrawals, $5,000 in total over the past 2 months, are all attributed to a J. Harrington, but there's no corresponding deposit trail." Katherine frowned. "Is Harrington a bank customer?" "I don't know, but these withdrawals align with the dates Wilson has been sending telegrams to Denver." Blake flipped back several pages. "And here a large deposit from the Denver Territorial Bank, listed as a loan settlement, but the amount doesn't match any loan records I can see." They continued searching, finding more discrepancies, investments recorded then mysteriously reversed, customer deposits that seemed to vanish from later tallies, expenses that appeared inflated. "He's been systematically skimming funds," Katherine concluded, a sense of vindication mixing with horror at the scale of the deception, "and using false entries to cover his tracks." "But why frame me specifically?" Blake wondered. "Why not just claim a general accounting error?" "Because a theft by an outsider would divert attention completely," Katherine reasoned. "No one would look deeper if they believed a simple robbery had occurred." She turned the page, then gasped. "Blake, look at this." The entry was dated just a week before Blake's arrival in town. A note in Wilson's handwriting indicating a special transaction with Harrington Brothers investment firm in Denver, with instructions to prepare for B. Kincaid withdrawal and ensure compensatory measures. "He knew you were coming," Katherine whispered. "He knew about your sale to Henderson and your planned withdrawal." Blake stared at the entry, his jaw tightening. Henderson must have wired ahead to confirm the bank could handle the transaction, and Wilson saw an opportunity. "We need to copy these entries," Katherine said urgently, "as evidence to show the sheriff." Blake nodded, pulling out a small notebook and pencil he'd brought for this purpose. As he began copying the most damning figures, Katherine continued scanning the ledger, looking for anything else that might strengthen their case. She was so absorbed in the task that she didn't hear the footsteps until it was almost too late. A floorboard creaked in the hallway outside, and Katherine's head snapped up in alarm. "Someone's coming," she hissed, dousing the lamp quickly. Blake pocketed his notebook and hurriedly replaced the ledger on the stack. They looked around frantically for a place to hide, but the council chamber offered little concealment. "The curtains," Katherine whispered, pointing to the heavy drapes that flanked the room's windows. They slipped behind them just as the door opened, pressing themselves against the wall and hardly daring to breathe. Through a tiny gap in the fabric, Katherine could see Wilson enter, accompanied by a tall, expensively dressed stranger. "I still don't understand why this meeting couldn't wait until morning, Harrington," Wilson was saying, his voice tight with anxiety. "The council will be here any minute." The stranger, Harrington, apparently removed his gloves deliberately. "Because our Denver office is getting nervous, Wilson. This Kincaid business was supposed to be resolved by now, the missing money attributed to theft, case closed. Instead, he's still in town, asking questions, and we hear he's got the school teacher helping him." Katherine felt Blake tense beside her. "That's just gossip," Wilson replied, though he didn't sound convinced. "The woman's simply soft-hearted, and Kincaid will be leaving soon. The sheriff is watching him closely. We can't afford soon, Wilson. The bank examiner arrives from Cheyenne in 3 days. If he discovers the discrepancies before we can replace the funds—" Harrington let the implication hang. "The investment will pay off," Wilson insisted. "Just another week. We don't have another week, and neither do you." Harrington's voice hardened. "Either you deal with Kincaid and retrieve the money he withdrew, all of it, or our firm will be forced to inform the banking commission of your creative accounting." Wilson's face paled. "You're threatening me, after everything I've done for your investment scheme." "I'm motivating you," Harrington corrected smoothly. "Find a way to discredit Kincaid completely, make him look guilty beyond doubt. If necessary, plant evidence. Just get it done tonight." The two men continued talking, moving toward the ledgers. Katherine held her breath, praying they wouldn't notice the books had been disturbed. Her heart was pounding so loudly she was certain they must hear it. Beside her, Blake shifted slightly, his arm pressing against hers in the narrow space behind the curtain. The contact was reassuring, grounding her in the midst of rising panic. After what seemed an eternity, voices in the hallway announced the arrival of the first council members. Wilson and Harrington exchanged a final, tense look before composing their expressions to greet the newcomers. As the room began filling with council members, Katherine and Blake remained frozen behind the curtain, trapped with no obvious means of escape. When Mrs. Winters entered, taking a seat that faced directly toward their hiding place, Katherine thought her heart might stop. The council meeting commenced, with Wilson presenting his monthly report in a voice that betrayed none of the tension from his earlier conversation. Katherine strained to hear every word, hoping for further evidence of his deception, but his presentation was carefully crafted to reveal nothing suspicious. When the financial portion of the meeting concluded and the council moved on to discussing road improvements, Blake touched Katherine's arm lightly and nodded toward the window behind them. Understanding his intent, she carefully tested whether it would open. To her relief, it slid up silently, evidently recently oiled. With agonizing slowness, they eased the window fully open. Blake went first, slipping through the opening and dropping the short distance to the ground outside. Katherine followed, gathering her skirts to avoid catching them on the sill. Once outside, they didn't speak until they had put considerable distance between themselves and the town hall, ducking into the shadow of the livery stable. "They're planning something tonight," Blake said urgently. "Something to frame me conclusively." "We need to go to the sheriff," Katherine insisted. "Show him the evidence we've collected." Blake shook his head. "Not yet. Harrington mentioned planting evidence. We need to know what they're planning before we approach Mills. If we move too soon, they'll simply deny everything and destroy whatever evidence exists of their scheme." "Then, what do we do?" Katherine asked, acutely aware that they were now involved in something far more dangerous than they'd initially imagined. Blake's expression was grim in the dim light. We watch Wilson, follow him, see what he does next, then we catch him in the act. That's too dangerous, Katherine protested. You heard Harrington, they're desperate. If they're willing to frame you for theft, what else might they do? I don't have a choice, Blake said firmly. This is my one chance to clear my name completely. I can't let them get away with it. Katherine knew arguing would be futile. The determination in his eyes told her he'd made his decision. Then I'm coming with you, she said, matching his resolve with her own. Katherine, no. This isn't your fight. It became my fight when I stood up for you in front of the town. She straightened her spine. Besides, 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. Blake looked as if he wanted to argue further, but the sound of the town hall doors opening interrupted them. Peering around the corner of the livery, they saw Wilson emerge, bidding good night to the council members before hurrying down the street toward the bank. He's on the move, Blake whispered. Stay close, but not too close. Together, they followed Wilson through the darkening streets, keeping to shadows and maintaining a discreet distance. The banker moved with purpose, checking over his shoulder occasionally but never spotting his pursuers. When Wilson reached the bank, he unlocked the front door and slipped inside. The building went dark for several minutes, then a faint light appeared in the back office. What's he doing in there? Katherine wondered aloud. Nothing good, Blake replied grimly. We need to get closer. They approached cautiously, using the gathering darkness as cover. A narrow alley ran alongside the bank, and at Blake's direction, they made their way down it to where a small window provided a view into Wilson's office. Standing on an empty crate, Blake peered through the window, then helped Katherine up to see as well. Inside, Wilson was hunched over his desk, writing something with frantic energy. Beside him lay an object that made Katherine's blood run cold, Blake's saddlebag. That's mine, Blake whispered, his voice tight with anger. He must have gotten it from my hotel room. They watched as Wilson placed several banknotes inside the bag, followed by a folded document. Then he removed a revolver from his desk drawer and added it to the saddlebag's contents. He's planting evidence, Katherine realized. Making it look like you stole more than just the withdrawal amount. Blake's jaw clenched. And the gun suggests I was prepared to use force. This is worse than I thought. Wilson closed the saddlebag and moved toward the door, clearly preparing to leave. Blake helped Katherine down from the crate. We need to stop him before he can place that bag somewhere it will be discovered, Blake said urgently. How? Katherine asked. If we confront him directly, it's his word against ours. Blake thought for a moment. We need witnesses, impartial ones who can't be dismissed as my allies. His eyes lit with sudden inspiration. The sheriff, if we can get Mills to see Wilson planting the evidence. But how do we convince the sheriff to come without explaining everything first? We don't have to, Blake replied. We just need to get him to the right place at the right time. He pulled out the small notebook containing the copied ledger entries. Take this to Sheriff Mills. Tell him you found it dropped outside the bank and thought it might be important. It's enough to make him suspicious, even if he doesn't fully believe Wilson's involved. Katherine took the notebook, understanding the plan. And you? I'll follow Wilson, see where he plans to plant the saddlebag. Once I know, I'll try to delay him until you can bring the sheriff. The danger of what they were proposing hung between them. If anything went wrong, if Wilson realized he was being followed, if the sheriff refused to come, if Harrington or his men were nearby, the consequences could be severe. As if reading her thoughts, Blake took her hands in his. You don't have to do this, Katherine. You could walk away now, pretend you were never involved. Katherine shook her head firmly. I made my choice when I said I believe you in front of the town. I'm not abandoning you now." Blake's eyes searched hers in the darkness, and for a moment Katherine thought he might kiss her. Instead, he squeezed her hands gently. "Be careful. If Mills doesn't believe you, don't push it. Just get yourself somewhere safe." "You too," she whispered. They parted quickly as Wilson emerged from the bank, the incriminating saddlebag tucked under his arm. Blake melted into the shadows to follow him, while Katherine hurried toward the sheriff's office, the notebook clutched tightly in her hand. Sheriff Mills was not in his office when Katherine arrived, breathless and anxious. The deputy informed her that Mills had gone to the saloon for his evening meal but should return shortly. "It's urgent that I speak with him," Katherine insisted. "A matter of town security." The young deputy looked uncertain. "I could fetch him for you, Miss Landon, but—" "Please," Katherine interrupted. "It's truly important." Something in her expression must have convinced him, for he nodded and headed for the door. "Wait here. I'll bring him right back." The minutes crawled by as Katherine waited in the small, austere office. She paced the wooden floor, clutching the notebook and praying that Blake was safe, that Wilson hadn't discovered his presence, that their plan would work. When the door finally opened to admit Sheriff Mills, his expression was a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "Miss Landon," he said with a nod. "Thompson says you have some urgent matter to discuss." Katherine launched into the story she and Blake had concocted, explaining how she had found the notebook outside the bank while taking an evening walk. She handed it to Mills, pointing out the discrepancies Blake had copied. "I don't understand all the banking terminology," she said, affecting an innocent tone, "but it seemed as if something wasn't right. And then I saw Mr. Wilson leaving the bank with a saddlebag that looked exactly like Mr. Kincaid's." Mills frowned as he examined the notebook. "These are serious discrepancies if they are accurate, but I can't just accuse the town's banker based on some figures in a dropped notebook." "Of course not," Katherine agreed quickly. "But perhaps you could speak with Mr. Wilson, ask him about these entries." "He was heading toward the livery stable when I last saw him." The sheriff studied her face, suspicion evident in his narrowed eyes. "You seem mighty interested in clearing Kincaid's name, Miss Landon." Katherine met his gaze steadily. "I'm interested in the truth, Sheriff, as I believe you are." For a long moment, Mills didn't respond. Then he sighed and reached for his hat. "I'll go have a word with Wilson, but I make no promises about what comes of it." "Thank you, Sheriff," Katherine said, relief washing through her. "That's all I ask." As they left the office together, Katherine hoped desperately that Blake had managed to follow Wilson without being detected, and that the banker hadn't already succeeded in planting the false evidence. The livery stable was dark and quiet when they approached, only the occasional soft nickering of horses breaking the silence. Katherine followed a few paces behind Mills, her heart racing with anxiety and anticipation. Just as they reached the entrance, a commotion erupted from inside, the sound of a scuffle, something falling, a man's voice raised in anger. Mills drew his gun and pushed Katherine behind him. "Stay here," he ordered, then called out, "This is Sheriff Mills. What's going on in there?" A shot rang out, the sound deafening in the enclosed space of the stable. Katherine gasped, fear for Blake overwhelming her. Ignoring Mills's instruction, she rushed forward into the dimly lit building. The scene that greeted her was chaotic. Wilson stood with his back to a stall, a smoking pistol in his hand. Blake was crouched behind a barrel, unharmed but clearly pinned down. The incriminating saddlebag lay open on the ground between them, its planted contents spilled out for all to see. "Wilson!" Mills shouted, his gun trained on the banker. "Drop that weapon!" Wilson's head snapped toward them, his eyes wild with desperation. "Sheriff, thank God you're here. I caught Kincaid hiding more stolen money in his saddlebag. When I confronted him, he attacked me. That's a lie. Blake called from his position. He brought that saddlebag here himself, filled with money he took from the bank and a gun he planted. He's been embezzling funds for months and tried to frame me for it. Mills looked between the two men, uncertainty clear in his expression. "Both of you stay exactly where you are," he ordered. "Wilson," I said, "drop that gun. Now." For a terrible moment, Katherine thought Wilson might refuse, might turn his weapon on the sheriff instead. But finally, the banker lowered his pistol, placing it on the ground with shaking hands. "Sheriff, you can't possibly believe this drifter over me," Wilson said, his voice trembling with either fear or rage. "I'm a respected member of this community." "Save it, Wilson," Mills interrupted. He moved cautiously into the stable, keeping his gun ready. "Miss Landon showed me some interesting figures from the bank's ledgers. Figures that suggest you've been playing fast and loose with other people's money." Wilson's face drained of color. His eyes darted to Katherine with a hatred that made her step back involuntarily. "You," he spat. "You meddling, careful," Blake warned, standing up now that Wilson was disarmed. "That's no way to address a lady." Mills bent to examine the contents of the saddlebag, his expression growing grimmer as he took in the bank notes and the planted gun. "This doesn't look good, Wilson." "Not good at all." He straightened up, keeping his revolver trained on the banker. "I think you'd better start explaining, beginning with why you're planting evidence in Kincaid's saddlebag." As if finally recognizing the futility of further denials, Wilson's shoulders slumped. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he muttered. "The investments were going to pay off. I was going to replace every cent." "The investments with Harrington Brothers?" Blake asked, moving closer now that Wilson seemed defeated. Wilson's head jerked up. "How did you?" "We overheard your conversation with Harrington at the town hall," Katherine admitted, stepping fully into the stable. "We know about the missing funds, the false entries, all of it." Mills looked between them with growing comprehension. "You two set this up," he said, not as an accusation but as a realization. "You knew Wilson was coming here to plant evidence." "We suspected," Blake corrected. "We couldn't be certain until we saw him do it." The sheriff nodded slowly, then turned back to Wilson. "I'm placing you under arrest for embezzlement, attempted fraud, and whatever else I can think of by the time we reach the jail." He produced a pair of handcuffs. "Turn around." As Mills secured the handcuffs on Wilson's wrists, Blake moved to Katherine's side. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, his eyes scanning her face with concern. "I am now," she replied, suddenly aware of how close they had come to disaster. "When I heard that shot." "He fired wild," Blake assured her. "More to scare than to hit." Mills led the subdued banker toward the stable entrance. "I'll need statements from both of you," he said over his shoulder. "And I'll want to see those original ledgers." He paused, giving them a measuring look. "You two took quite a risk. Could have gotten yourselves killed." "Some things are worth the risk, Sheriff," Blake replied, his eyes still on Katherine. As Mills escorted Wilson to the jail, Blake and Katherine remained in the stable, the aftermath of danger creating an intimacy between them that neither seemed willing to break. "We did it," Katherine said softly. "We cleared your name." Blake nodded, his expression serious despite their victory. "At what cost to you, though? Standing against Wilson, helping me investigate the town won't forget that quickly." "I don't regret it," Katherine insisted. "Not for a moment." Blake reached out, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear that had escaped during the excitement. "You're an extraordinary woman, Katherine Landon. I've never met anyone quite like you." The tenderness in his touch, in his voice, made Katherine's breath catch. "What happens now?" she asked, the question encompassing far more than just the immediate future. "Now," Blake said, his hand lingering near her face. Wilson will face justice. Harrington, too, once the banking commission gets involved. The stolen funds will likely be recovered, at least partially. And you? Katherine pressed, suddenly afraid of his answer. Will you still leave Medicine Bow? Blake was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. I came here to make a withdrawal and move on to find a place to start my ranch. He took a deep breath. But now I'm thinking maybe I've already found something worth staying for. Katherine's heart beat faster at his words, at the unspoken question in them. Medicine Bow could use a man of integrity like you, she said softly. Someone who stands up for the truth, no matter the cost. Is that the only reason I should stay? Blake asked, moving closer until barely a handspan separated them. Katherine summoned her courage. No, she whispered. Not the only reason. Blake's hand cupped her cheek gently, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. I've known you less than a week, Katherine Landon, yet I feel as if I've been waiting for you my whole life. I felt it too, she admitted. From the moment I said I believe you in that crowd, something connected between us, something worth exploring. He suggested, his face now so close she could feel his breath on her lips. Definitely worth exploring, Katherine agreed, and then his mouth was on hers, gentle at first, then with growing passion as she responded to his kiss. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Blake rested his forehead against hers. I should warn you, he said with a smile in his voice. Courting a man with my reputation might not improve your standing with the school board. Katherine laughed softly. Given what we've just uncovered about the town banker, I suspect the board will have more pressing matters to concern them than my choice of suitors. Suitors, is it? Blake teased, his arms encircling her waist. That sounds promisingly formal. Well, Mr. Kincaid, Katherine replied, her hands resting on his chest. I am a proper Boston schoolteacher after all. Some conventions must be observed. I'll call on you properly tomorrow then, Blake promised. With flowers and everything a proper Boston schoolteacher might expect. I'd like that, Katherine said, smiling up at him. But Blake, yes. Let's make sure this saddlebag of yours is securely locked away as evidence first. I've grown rather tired of it causing us trouble. Blake laughed, the sound rich and warm in the quiet stable. A wise suggestion, Miss Landon. Very wise indeed. The following weeks brought dramatic changes to Medicine Bow. Wilson's arrest and subsequent confession uncovered a scheme that had defrauded the bank of over $20,000. Harrington was apprehended in Denver, and investigators discovered the investment firm had been running similar operations in several frontier towns. To everyone's relief, most of the stolen funds were recovered, saving the bank from collapse and protecting the townspeople's savings. The revelation that Blake had been deliberately framed transformed public opinion almost overnight. The cowboy, who had been viewed with suspicion, became a hero for helping expose the corruption. For Katherine, the transition was equally dramatic. The school board, initially inclined to dismiss her for unbecoming conduct, found themselves facing a community that now celebrated her role in uncovering the truth. Parents who had once whispered about her association with Blake now pointed to her courage as an example for their children. True to his word, Blake called on Katherine the day after Wilson's arrest, bearing wildflowers and a formality that made her smile. In the days that followed, they were seen walking together, dining at the hotel, attending church side by side. The town watched their courtship unfold with interest that gradually transformed from scandal to support. 3 months after the eventful night at the livery stable, Blake purchased a small ranch 10 miles outside of Medicine Bow, close enough for Katherine to continue teaching while they built their future together. On a crisp October afternoon, with the aspen trees blazing gold against the blue Wyoming sky, they stood together on the porch of that ranch house, Blake's arm around Katherine's shoulders as they gazed at their land. "What are you thinking?" he asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Katherine leaned into his embrace. "I was thinking about that day in town, the day we met, how different everything might have been if I hadn't spoken up." Blake pressed a kiss to her temple. "I've wondered that myself. What made you step forward? You didn't know me at all." "Something in your eyes," Katherine replied honestly. "A certainty, an integrity I couldn't ignore, and perhaps—" she smiled slightly. "Perhaps my heart recognized something my mind hadn't yet realized, that we were meant to find each other," Blake suggested, turning her in his arms to face him. "It sounds rather fanciful when you put it that way," Katherine admitted. "But yes, something like that." Blake's hand came up to caress her cheek, a gesture that had become precious to her in their months together. "I have something for you," he said, suddenly serious. "Something I've been carrying around for weeks, waiting for the right moment." Katherine's heart quickened as he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "Blake." He opened the box to reveal a ring, a simple gold band with a single diamond that caught the late afternoon sunlight. "I'm not a wealthy man, Katherine. I have this land, a small herd and hopes for the future. But everything I have, everything I am, I want to share with you." He took a deep breath. "Katherine Landon, will you marry me?" Tears welled in Katherine's eyes as she looked from the ring to the face of the man she had come to love so deeply in such a short time. "Yes," she whispered, then more firmly, "Yes, Blake Kincaid, I will marry you." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into a kiss that promised a lifetime of love, Katherine knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice that day in town. When she had stood beside a falsely accused cowboy and said, "I believe you," she had unknowingly taken the first step toward her own happiness. They were married in Medicine Bow's small church 3 weeks later, with the entire town in attendance. Mrs. Winters wiped away tears as she pronounced them perfectly suited, while Sheriff Mills joked that he'd never seen a romance begin with an arrest before. In the spring of 1877, as new grass carpeted the ranch land and calves wobbled alongside their mothers, Katherine discovered she was expecting their first child. Blake's joy at the news was matched only by his protective concern, insisting she reduce her teaching hours as her pregnancy progressed. Their son, James William Kincaid, arrived on a snowy December night, with Mrs. Winters serving as midwife and Blake pacing anxiously until the infant's first cry rang through the ranch house. When Blake held his son for the first time, the look of wonder and love on his face made all the pain of labor worthwhile for Katherine. "He has your eyes," Blake whispered, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed beside her, "and hopefully your brains. Poor child will need them if he inherits my stubborn streak." Katherine laughed tiredly, reaching out to touch the downy head of their newborn. "I rather like your stubborn streak. It's what brought us here after all." As young James grew, the Kincaid ranch prospered. Blake's careful management and hard work expanded their herd and their acreage. Katherine continued to teach part-time, bringing James with her to the schoolhouse, until he was old enough to toddle around the ranch under his father's watchful eye. 2 years after James's birth, their family grew again with the arrival of twin daughters, Sarah and Elizabeth. Blake joked that he was now hopelessly outnumbered, but the pride in his voice when he spoke of his 3 Kincaid women was unmistakable. Medicine Bow changed too over the years. The railroad brought new prosperity, new families, new opportunities. The town grew, but never lost its frontier character or its memory of the banking scandal that had nearly ruined many of its citizens. On the 5th anniversary of their marriage, Blake surprised Katherine with a trip to Boston, her first return to her childhood home since coming west. They stayed in a grand hotel, visited the places of Katherine's youth, and introduced the children to the world their mother had left behind. "Do you ever regret it?" Blake asked one evening as they walked along Boston Common, the children asleep back at the hotel under the care of a hired nurse. "Leaving all this civilization for the wildness of Wyoming?" Katherine considered the question seriously, looking around at the manicured park, the elegant buildings, the fashionable people strolling past. "Not for a moment," she said finally. "Boston was my past, but Medicine Bow, our ranch, our family, that's my present and future. That's where I found not just a home, but myself." Blake squeezed her hand. "You found me too, don't forget." "As if I could," Katherine laughed, leaning her head against his shoulder. "The falsely accused cowboy who stole my heart." "While you," Blake replied, kissing the top of her head, "were the schoolteacher brave enough to say I believe you when no one else would." 10 years after Wilson's arrest, as Katherine watched Blake teaching 13-year-old James how to rope a calf, with the twins chattering excitedly beside her and their youngest, 4-year-old Michael, clinging to her skirts, she reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From that moment of moral certainty in Medicine Bow's dusty street to this life, they had built together a thriving ranch, 4 beautiful children, a love that had only deepened with time and trials. It hadn't always been easy. There had been droughts and blizzards, financial worries and health scares, the ordinary challenges that test any marriage. But through it all, they had faced each difficulty together, with the same courage and integrity that had drawn them to each other from the start. And if Katherine could somehow go back to that pivotal day and advise her younger self, she would say only this: keep believing. The journey ahead is more wonderful than you can imagine. As if sensing her thoughts, Blake looked up from his roping lesson and caught her eye across the corral. The smile they exchanged held a decade of shared memories, challenges overcome, and a love that had transformed both their lives. In that smile was everything Katherine had ever hoped for, and so much more than she had ever dared to dream on that spring day in 1876, when she had stood beside a falsely accused cowboy and said, with all the certainty in her heart, "I believe you."